The snow came down in long, unbroken veils, blurring the world into white until the sky and earth seemed stitched from the same cloth. Aurora Callahan pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the thin wool had long since surrendered to the cold. Each step cracked the crust of ice beneath her boots, and she could hear the brittle sound of her younger sister's breath behind her, ragged and uneven. Nova stumbled, clutching the small bundle that carried the last of their bread, now frozen stiff as rock. They had been told the trail would lead them to safety, to a cabin prepared by a family friend. Instead, it had led them into the storm's blind heart, where every tree looked the same and every path vanished beneath drifts that reached their knees. Aurora kept her chin raised, though her bones ached with weariness. All her life, she had been told to carry herself with dignity, even when mocked, even when hungry. She remembered the town women's sharp whispers as they passed, 21 and still not chosen. Sisters left on the shelf. The words clung to her like ice on her hem. She had tried not to let Nova hear, though Nova always heard more than she admitted. "Do you see it?" Nova's voice was thin, a thread in the wind. Aurora looked, squinting into the swirl. There, through the veil of snow, stood the outline of a cabin, slanted and weather-beaten, a dark blot against the endless white. Relief rushed through her chest, though it soured quickly. The cabin sagged as if abandoned, its roof bowed beneath snow, its shutters torn away by storms long past. It was not the haven they had been promised. Still, it was shelter, and shelter could mean the difference between life and a white grave. They pressed forward, shoulders bent against the wind, until Aurora's numb hands found the door. It hung crooked on its hinges, groaning when she pushed. Inside was silence, broken only by the whisper of snow finding cracks. The hearth was cold, cobwebs stringing the corners, and the smell of rot lingered faintly beneath the timber's damp. Nova set the bread down with trembling fingers. "This isn't it," she whispered, her voice heavy with disappointment. Her face, rounder, softer than Aurora's, was flushed from cold, but her eyes carried the same weary shame Aurora felt. They were women without place, without claim, sent along roads that ended in ghost houses. Aurora touched the table, its surface scarred by old knife marks. She thought of the warm fires they had glimpsed in other homes, of doors never opened to them. This cabin, deserted and hollow, seemed a cruel reflection of what the world thought they deserved. "We'll make do," Aurora said, though the words felt thin as paper. She lit one of their last matches, but the damp would refuse to catch. The spark flared, then died, leaving the room darker than before. Nova sank onto a broken chair, pressing her hands together as if in prayer. "Why did God bring us here?" she murmured. Aurora had no answer. She wrapped her arms around herself and sat beside her sister, listening to the storm claw against the walls. The cabin felt like a coffin waiting to be sealed. Time stretched. The cold crept deeper, needling into their joints. Aurora thought of their mother, who had died years before, and of the townsfolk who had sent them away with pity disguised as charity. She tried to steel herself against despair, but a heaviness pressed her chest until tears pricked her eyes. Then, faint at first, almost mistaken for the storm, came the sound of footsteps. Not the brittle crack of snow beneath small boots, but a heavier rhythm, deliberate and slow. Aurora froze, hand flying to the knife hidden in her skirts. Nova looked at her wide-eyed, clutching her shawl as though cloth could guard her. The door shifted. Snow gusted in as the figure filled the frame, towering and still. He was bare-chested despite the storm, his dark skin marked with scars that caught the pale light. His hair, long and black, was damp with melting snow, and his eyes, piercing, steady, fell on them like weight. For a breath, neither sister moved, caught between fear and awe. Aurora's voice cracked the silence. "This cabin, it's abandoned. We meant no harm." The man did not speak at once. He stepped inside, snow hissing as it clung to his skin, and the space seemed smaller with him in it. His gaze lingered on the broken hearth, on the sisters shivering in their threadbare dresses, before lifting again. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough as stone worn by water, yet steady. "Not abandoned," he said. "Mine." Aurora's heart hammered. Her grip on the knife tightened, though she knew how foolish it was. Her strength against his was nothing. Beside her, Nova whispered, "Please, we only needed shelter." The man looked between them, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for the hearth, struck flint against steel, and coaxed a flame from kindling hidden beneath furs. Within moments, fire licked upward, casting light across his broad shoulders and the shadows of his scars. Warmth bled into the room, chasing the frost from the air. Aurora felt tears threaten again, though from a different well this time. She forced her voice calm. "Why would you help us?" He bent toward the fire, feeding it until it roared. Only then did he lift his gaze, and the weight of it made her breath falter. His lips moved, quiet enough that the storm nearly swallowed his words. "Because," he whispered, as if confessing to the flames themselves, "God finally sent you to us." The words settled into the cabin, heavy with meaning, strange yet solemn. Aurora glanced at Nova, whose eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight. Neither knew what fate they had stepped into, but both felt, with a shiver deeper than cold, that the storm had carried them exactly where it meant to. The fire cracked and its glow licked across the cabin walls, illuminating years of neglect. The sagging beams, the spiderwebbed corners, the dust that rose when the sisters moved. Yet beneath the ruin, the room had transformed. Where moments before it had been a tomb of ice and silence, now warmth pressed gently at their numb skin. The scent of burning pine mixing with faint smoke carried in from the man's hair and clothing. Aurora sat stiffly, her back straight against the chair's rough edge, though her body longed to sag. Nova leaned closer to the fire, stretching her small hands toward the glow as if it might breathe life back into them. The stranger crouched nearby, silent. His broad frame filled the hearth's light, throwing shadows that seemed larger than the cabin itself. His scars, revealed in firelight, told of old battles, each mark a story neither girl dared ask. His stillness was uncanny, not the idleness of someone resting, but the watchfulness of one who had lived too long on the edge of suspicion. His gaze did not waver from the fire, though Aurora felt its weight all the same, as if he measured their every breath. She cleared her throat, her voice careful. We thought this place was empty." He did not answer. Instead he rose, moving with the deliberate quiet of one who knows how sound travels in the wild. From the corner, he pulled down a bundle of pelts and tossed them toward Nova's lap. The furs were thick, heavy with the musk of animal, but the warmth that radiated from them was blessing enough. Nova whispered thank you, her words soft as ash, but the man did not acknowledge her, as though gratitude was neither required nor understood. Aurora studied him in secret, her pulse restless. The women of town had spoken of Apaches in voices sharp with fear. Savages, they said, with bloodlust in their veins. Yet the man before her, shirtless though snow clung to his shoulders, had kindled fire instead of striking them down. Still, she could not silence the whisper that reminded her they were two women alone, vulnerable, in a cabin claimed by him. Nova broke the quiet, her tone gentler. "What should we call you?" For a moment, Aurora thought he might not reply. Then his voice, low and rough, slipped through the firelight. "Dakota." Nova repeated it softly, as if testing its shape on her tongue. Aurora said nothing, though the name rooted itself in her mind with strange weight. They ate a piece of bread softened near the fire, though it tasted more of ash than grain. Hunger made them grateful for every bite. Dakota himself did not eat, only sat back against the wall, his dark eyes unreadable. Aurora wondered if he had been watching the storm for days, waiting for something, or someone, to stumble to his door. His earlier words rang again in her head. God finally sent you to us. Us, though no one else lived here. When sleep tugged at Nova's lashes, Dakota spread furs across the corner and motioned. Aurora hesitated before guiding her sister down. Nova curled like a child, her breath slowing, and soon the room held only the fire's crackle and the storm's muted howl. Aurora remained upright, unable to surrender to rest. Dakota sat opposite, his gaze still fixed on the flames, though she sensed he saw everything. Her shifting shoulders, the way her hand brushed her skirts to find the knife still hidden there. "You're alone here?" she asked, not because she needed the answer, but because silence pressed too hard. Dakota did not look at her. "Alone," he confirmed, and the single word carried both truth and grief. Aurora's chest tightened. Alone was a word she knew too well. Alone in the market where eyes turned away, alone when suitors chose others, alone when town whispers followed like burrs clinging to wool. She watched the lines of Takota's face, how they seemed carved by more than age, and wondered if his aloneness was born of choice or exile. The fire dimmed, and Takota rose, feeding it with care that bordered on reverence. He whispered in his tongue, words she could not understand, but the rhythm sounded like prayer. His voice was low, almost a hum, carrying a sorrow that made her throat ache. "What do you say?" she asked. He paused, turning his face half toward her. The flames painted bronze across his cheekbones, shadows across his eyes. "I speak to the ones gone before, so they do not forget me." The answer struck deep, for Aurora often prayed at her mother's grave, fearing her name would fade from memory. Shame, grief, exile. Threads of the same cloth bound them, though their worlds were distant. Takota returned to his place. Aurora leaned closer to the fire, feeling the heat soak through her skirts. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine this cabin not as a ruin, but as a place remade. Hearth warm, table set, laughter instead of whispers. Yet reality clung sharp. The town would never allow it. Already, she pictured the sneers, the preacher's voice condemning, the men who believed they owned the right to decide a woman's fate. Her hands trembled slightly, and she pressed them against her knees. Takota noticed. She could tell by the flicker in his gaze, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached to the wall, took down a small wooden carving, and set it beside her. The figure was worn smooth, a bird in flight, wings spread. She touched it hesitantly, feeling the grooves. "For you," he murmured. Aurora lifted her eyes to his, uncertain how to answer. No man had ever offered her anything without demand behind it. She opened her mouth, but words failed. Instead, she held the carving close, feeling its warmth from his hand linger. Night deepened, the storm relentless. The fire burned steady, casting light across their faces, weaving them together in silence. When finally her body sagged, Aurora laid beside her sister, the bird still clasped in her palm. Sleep claimed her, restless with dreams of judgmental eyes and whispered prayers. Sometime near dawn, she stirred. The fire still glowed faintly, and Takota still sat, as though carved from stone, his eyes fixed not on the flames but on her. His lips moved again, whispering words in his language, softer than before, almost tender. Aurora held her breath, pretending sleep, listening. She caught fragments, syllables shaped with care, a rhythm almost like mourning. Yet when his voice dropped lower still, she thought she heard her name, wrapped into prayer as if it belonged among his ghosts. Her heart beat faster, confusion warring with warmth, fear tangled with something stranger still. She shut her eyes before he could see them open, though the sound of his whisper lingered, more haunting than the storm. Snow thawed slowly in the days that followed, though the world outside remained hard as iron. Aurora and Nova woke each morning wrapped in furs, the warmth of Takota's fire seeping into their bones, though the shame of their dependence lingered like a bruise. Each day carried a quiet rhythm, fetching water from the frozen creek, mending torn hems, sharing bread made from what little grain remained. Takota moved among them like a shadow, his silence steady, his hands calloused yet gentle in every task. Yet always, Aurora felt the weight of something unspoken pressing heavier than the snow. It was necessity that drove them into town. The bread was nearly gone, and Takota's cabin, though protective, held no stores beyond dried herbs and pelts. Aurora tried to hide her reluctance, but when Takota strapped on his boots and motioned toward the trail, she felt a tremor of dread. Nova, hopeful and eager, smoothed her dress as best she could, whispering, "It'll be good to see people again." Aurora said nothing, though the image of town faces tightening in judgment already haunted her. The journey was quiet, save for the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional whisper of wind through bare branches. Takota walked ahead, carrying a bundle of pelts on his back, his bare arms inked with the marks of his people. Aurora's eyes caught them often, though she looked away quickly each time, fearing what such attentions might mean. The town appeared at last, its roofs lined with icicles, smoke curling from chimneys. For a moment, Nova smiled, as though the sight promised belonging. But the moment they stepped onto the main street, Voices hushed. Women at the well lowered their pails. Men outside the mercantile folded their arms. It was not the silence of indifference, but of sharpened attention, as though every eye cut into them like glass. Aurora kept her head high, her hands clenched in her shawl. Nova's smile faltered. Dakota walked as though unaware, though Aurora could feel the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened against their stares. The storekeeper, Mr. Brannigan, hesitated when they entered. His gaze lingered too long on Dakota before flicking toward the sisters, his voice dry as parchment. "Callahan's. Thought you two were headed elsewhere." Aurora swallowed. "Plans changed. We'll need flour. And salt." Brannigan's eyes slid to the pelts Dakota laid on the counter. "Fine work," he muttered, though without warmth. He weighed them too slowly, as though savoring the discomfort in the room. Behind them, whispers began. Two women spoke just loud enough for Aurora to hear. "Settler girls sharing a cabin with him? Scandalous." Another voice joined, dripping with pity. "Poor things, desperate enough to live like savages." Aurora's cheeks burned, though she kept her eyes forward. Nova reached for her hand, squeezing it tight, but her grip trembled. Reverend Elias Harlan entered then, his black coat trailing snow, his eyes stern as sermon. He looked first at the sisters, then at Dakota, his jaw tightening. "This is not fitting," he said, his voice filling the room. "Young women under the care of a man like this. It breeds sin and worse, shame upon your names." Aurora's breath caught, though she forced her voice steady. "We were freezing. He saved us." Harlan's gaze was sharp. "Better to suffer the cold than to lose what little virtue you have left." His words hung like frost, each one meant to break them. Dakota stood silent, his face unreadable. But Aurora saw how his hand curled slightly, how his chest rose as though holding back something fierce. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and ache, for in his silence, he bore the insult that should have been hers. They gathered their goods quickly, leaving the mercantile with eyes following like shadows. Outside, Nova's tears fell silently, freezing on her cheeks before she wiped them away. "Why do they hate us so?" she whispered. Aurora tightened her shawl, though the cold came not from weather but from judgment. "Because we didn't do what they expected," she murmured. Her gaze flicked to Dakota, who walked ahead, the pelts gone, his hands empty. The journey back was longer, weighed by silence. At the cabin, Nova retreated to the corner, curling beneath furs as though to hide. Aurora lingered near the hearth, watching Dakota hang the flower carefully, as though the act itself carried reverence. At last, she spoke. "You knew, didn't you? That they'd see us that way." Dakota's eyes lifted, steady on hers. "They see what they want." His words struck deep, for Aurora knew them true. The town had always seen her as less pretty, less wanted, less worthy. Now they saw her as worse, though nothing in her had changed but her shelter. She touched the small carving he had given her the night before, still hidden in her pocket. The wood was smooth against her palm, a reminder that kindness need not be spoken to be real. Shame had always been her cloak, but in his presence, she felt it loosen, even as the world tried to bind it tighter. Night fell heavy. The fire's glow flickered against the log walls, chasing shadows that seemed older than any of them. Nova's quiet breathing filled the corner, while Dakota sat cross-legged by the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Aurora watched him, her thoughts restless. The town's judgment had always been cruel, but now it carried danger. Men spoke of rescuing, but she knew rescue was not what they sought. Control wore many masks, pity, morality, righteousness, but its hand always sought to press down. She leaned forward, her voice low. "They'll come again. Not with words this time." Dakota's hand stilled. His dark eyes lifted, meeting hers across the firelight. For the first time since she had known him, she saw not only quiet endurance but a flicker of something sharper, a flame banked yet alive. "Yes," he said simply. The word settled heavy, not as warning but as promise. Aurora felt a shiver crawl her spine, though it was not from cold. The storm outside had quieted, but another storm, louder, more dangerous, was gathering, and they all knew it. In the silence that followed, Aurora touched the carving again, its bird in flight. She wondered if dignity, once taken, could ever return, or if it must be seized, even at cost. Her eyes lingered on Takota's scars, each one proof of battles survived, and she wondered what scars she would carry when this judgment reached their door. The fire cracked sharply, sparks rising like stars. Aurora flinched, then drew a breath, steadying her resolve. She looked at Takota, her voice trembling but certain. "If they come, I won't leave." His gaze held hers, unreadable yet burning. Then, softly, he spoke words she did not expect, words that carried both danger and strange safety. "They already walk toward us." The storm broke in the night, sweeping the valley with a roar of wind that rattled the cabin's bones. Snow pressed against the windows, thick as wool, and the door shuddered in its frame with every gust. Inside, the fire burned high, its glow painting the walls in restless flickers, as though the room itself breathed. Aurora sat near the hearth, mending a tear in her shawl with clumsy stitches. The thread kept knotting in her cold fingers, but the rhythm steadied her. Nova hummed softly beside her, the tune of a hymn their mother once sang, though the melody wavered like a candle flame in draught. Takota moved in silence, stacking wood near the fire. The muscles across his back flexed with the work, the scars cutting pale lines against his dark skin. Aurora tried not to look, yet her eyes wandered despite herself, caught between fear and a strange, reluctant admiration. He was a man marked by violence, but the way he tended the fire, each log laid with care, spoke of a gentleness that unsettled her more than the scars. The storm's howl thickened. Beyond the door, faint voices carried, muffled by wind but undeniable. Aurora stiffened, the needle pausing mid-stitch. Takota glanced at her, then at the door, his face a mask of calm though his body had stilled. "They came sooner than I thought," he murmured. Nova's hum faltered, her eyes widening. "Who?" Aurora answered for him, her voice low. "The men from town." The air thickened, heavy with unspoken fears. Nova clutched her shawl tighter, retreating toward the corner. Aurora laid her stitching aside and rose, her legs trembling though she forced them steady. Takota remained by the fire, his knife within reach, but his eyes lingered on her rather than the door. "They will not ask," he said quietly. "They will take." Aurora's throat tightened. She thought of the preacher's stern eyes, the whispered scorn of the women, the way pity could become cruelty in a breath. She had been powerless against their judgment before, but something inside her shifted, as though the fire at her back had spread to her chest. "We can't let them." The words slipped out before she could measure them. Her voice shook, but conviction steadied it. Takota studied her, and for the first time, his gaze softened. "You would stand against your own people?" "They're not my people," she whispered, surprising herself with the truth of it. "They never were." The knock came then, hard, impatient, fists against wood. The sound rattled the cabin like a gunshot. Nova whimpered, covering her ears. Aurora stepped closer to the door, though fear prickled every inch of her skin. "Open, Callahan's." A man's voice bellowed, muffled by storm. "You've no business in there with him." Aurora looked to Takota. His hand rested on the knife, but he did not move. "If you open," he said, "they will not listen. If you refuse, they will break it down." Her breath trembled. She thought of the small carving in her pocket, the bird in flight. It steadied her hand as she reached for the door latch. The door shuddered again, snow blasting inward as she cracked it open. Lantern light spilled in from the storm, illuminating three men, their faces red from cold, their eyes sharp with anger. Samuel Pike stood at their front, his jaw clenched, his gloved hand already gripping the butt of his pistol. "Aurora," he said, his voice tight with false pity. "Come out. Bring your sister. You're not safe here." Aurora met his eyes, her heart hammering. "We are safe." Pike's gaze flicked past her, landing on Takota's frame silhouetted by firelight. His lips curled. "With him? You think he cares for your safety? He's using you. Don't you see?" Behind her, Nova whimpered. Takota rose then, his shadow filling the doorway, his presence commanding without a word. Pike stepped back, hand twitching toward his pistol, but the storm whipped harder, snow stinging their faces. Aurora stood straighter, forcing her voice through the wind. He saved us. None of you would have. The men shifted, uncomfortable, but Pike barked. You've been bewitched. You'll thank me when you're free of him. He motioned to the others, and one stepped forward, lifting a boot as if to shove the door wide. Before Aurora could flinch, Dakota moved. Not with violence, but with a swiftness that froze them. He slammed the door shut, the wood reverberating like a drum. The latch held, though the frame groaned under fists that followed. Inside, the fire flared as though in answer. Aurora's chest heaved, fear battling with defiance. Nova clung to her arm, trembling, but Dakota's calm steadied the room. They will come back, he said softly. More of them. Aurora met his gaze, her own filled with exhaustion and fury. Then we'll be ready. The words surprised her, yet once spoken, they felt true. For the first time in her life, she was not shrinking from judgment, but standing against it. Hours passed in tense silence, the storm wrapping the cabin in a white shroud. They kept the fire alive, each tending it in turn, as though the flames themselves were their shield. Dakota carved quietly, shaping wood with deliberate strokes, while Aurora mended again, her hands steadier now. Nova hummed once more, her song trembling but unbroken. When the wind eased, Aurora felt the weight of fatigue press her down. She leaned against the hearth, the warmth soaking her bones. Dakota glanced at her, his expression unreadable, yet his hand brushed another fur toward her shoulders. She accepted without words, the gesture heavier than speech. She studied his face then, the lines etched deep, the shadows beneath his eyes. "Why do you stay here?" she asked, her voice low. His knife paused. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then he set the carving down, exhaling. "I would not kill. My people called it weakness. The town calls it savagery. So I stay here between worlds, belonging to neither." Aurora's throat tightened. His exile mirrored her own. The town had marked her unworthy long before this night. She reached into her pocket, touched the wooden bird he had given her, and felt courage stir. "You're not between worlds," she whispered. "You've made your own." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not only loneliness but a flicker of something fierce, something that recognized her words as more than kindness. The fire hissed, a log collapsing in on itself. Shadows leapt across the walls, and for a moment the cabin seemed a place remade, bound not by judgment but by shared defiance. But then, from beyond the storm's hush, came the unmistakable sound of voices. More this time, closer, their tone angrier. Lantern light bobbed in the distance, approaching through the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. Aurora rose, her hand trembling against the doorframe. "They're coming back." Dakota's gaze hardened, his hand finding the knife once more. The firelight caught the blade, flashing bright against the dark. "Yes," he said, his voice low, steady as stone. "And this time, they will not leave so easily." The lanterns drew closer, their light swinging wildly in the snow, voices raised with the heat of men who had convinced themselves that righteousness belonged to them alone. Aurora stood at the door, her pulse loud in her ears, her hand pressed against the wood as though she could bar them back with the weight of her will. Behind her, Nova clung to the furs, her face pale with fear, while Dakota crouched near the fire, his knife gleaming as he tested the edge. The air inside the cabin was thick, not only with smoke but with tension, as though even the logs in the walls braced for the blow to come. The first strike rattled the frame, snow sifting from the rafters. Another came, harder, until the door bowed inward. Samuel Pike's voice cut through the storm, sharp as a whip. "Come out. We won't ask again. The town won't stand for this sin." Aurora's throat burned with anger. Sin, always that word, wielded like a weapon. She turned to Dakota, who had risen now, his tall frame casting shadows across the firelit room. His eyes met hers, steady, calm even in the face of violence. In them she read a question, unspoken. "Will you stand with me?" She swallowed, then nodded once. The shift was small, but it carried the weight of a vow. For the first time in her life, she would not yield to their judgment. The door split under the next blow. Cold air burst in, lantern light spilling across the floor as the men surged forward. Pike stepped first, pistol drawn, his face red with rage and snow. Two others followed, clubs in hand, their boots stomping against the planks. "Stand aside," Pike barked at Aurora, his eyes fixed on Dakota. "You've been fooled long enough. We'll drag you out if we must." But Aurora did not move. She drew the knife from her skirts, the small kitchen blade that had always seemed pitiful in her hands, and lifted it between herself and the men. Her arm trembled, yet her voice carried firm. "You will not take us. Not tonight." Pike blinked, startled by the defiance. He sneered, his words spitting through clenched teeth. "You'd raise steel against your own kind?" "You are not my kind," Aurora said, each syllable like struck iron. The men shifted uneasily, but Pike pressed forward, lifting his pistol higher. Dakota moved then, swift as stormwind, placing himself between them. His knife flashed, not in wild fury but with controlled precision, each step forward pushing the intruders back. He did not strike first, though every muscle in his body coiled with readiness. Snow gusted in through the shattered door, the fire crackling louder as if urging the moment to its peak. Pike hesitated, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. His pistol trembled just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in his grip. Aurora's heart thundered. She had lived her whole life bowed under shame, yielding to every whispered judgment. Now, standing in the doorway of a broken cabin, she felt something fierce take root inside her. "Go!" she demanded, her knife held steady. "Leave us, or face what you fear." The room seemed to hold its breath. Pike's eyes darted from her to Dakota, then to Nova trembling behind the fire. He saw not just a man alone, but two women standing with him, unbroken despite the weight of scorn. The storm howled louder, drowning the silence, until at last Pike spat on the floorboards. "This isn't over," he growled, lowering his pistol. "You'll regret this choice." With a sharp motion he turned, pushing the others out into the snow. Their lanterns swayed as they retreated, swallowed by the blizzard, their curses carried off by the wind. The door, half broken, swung loosely on its hinge, creaking as the storm pressed against it. Inside, silence fell, heavy and trembling. Nova burst into sobs, covering her face with her hands. Aurora lowered her knife at last, her arm aching from the strain, her knees weak. She swayed, but Dakota caught her before she fell, his hand steady against her arm. "You did not bend," he said softly, his voice like embers in the dark. Aurora met his gaze, her breath uneven. "Neither did you." For a moment, the world seemed narrowed to the two of them, the storm outside no more than a distant hum. She saw the scars on his chest, the lines of exile carved into his face, and she realized how alike they were. Both cast aside, both judged unworthy, yet both still standing. The firelight caught his eyes, and in them she saw not only strength but the possibility of belonging. Nova rose shakily, wiping her tears. She crossed the room and clutched Aurora's hand, whispering, "We're still here." Her words, fragile as they were, carried the truth of survival. Together, they braced the door as best they could, piling wood against it until the storm and the silence pressed in once more. The cabin smelled of smoke and sweat, of pine and fear, yet also of something new, resolve. Dakota sat by the fire again, his knife laid across his knees. Aurora joined him, her sister curled in furs behind. They did not speak for a long time, the crackle of the flames their only language. Yet in the quiet, something bound them closer than words. At last, Aurora pulled the small carving from her pocket, the bird in flight. She turned it in her hand, feeling the smooth grain beneath her thumb. Holding it toward Dakota, she whispered, "This is what you gave me. Tonight, I give it back. Not to return it, but to share it. We'll carry it together." Dakota's eyes lingered on the carving, then on her face. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead he reached out, covering her hand with his own, their fingers closing around the bird as though sealing a vow. The fire surged higher, casting their shadows across the walls. No longer separate shapes, but woven together, unbroken. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different storm had settled. one that had carved dignity from shame and belonging from rejection. And yet, even as warmth wrapped around them, Aurora's gaze flicked to the broken door. Beyond the storm, she could almost feel the weight of the town pressing closer, the promise of more conflict yet to come. Her breath steadied, her grip tightening on Takota's hand. "We'll face it," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Takota's answer was quiet, but it burned with certainty. "We already have." The fire popped, sparks leaping like stars into the rafters. The snow outside whispered against the walls, as though the night itself bore witness to the vow sealed in silence.